Perspective, presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people, living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow. Hello, folks, and thanks again for being here with us. I'm Harry Greenberger. I'm the president of the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association and the host for this show. And today we have as our guest Mr. David Loomis. I first became aware of David when I learned of his recently published book called The Coffee Shop Chronicles of New Orleans. And so I contacted David and asked him if he'd be on our show, but that's about all I know about you. Tell us something about who you are, what your background is.
All right, be happy to, and thank you for having me on the show. I'm originally from Paducah, Kentucky, which is on the Ohio River, which runs into the Mississippi River. It's actually its largest tributary.
So that's your connection to New Orleans.
That's my connection. That's what brought me here. It was destiny, not God, but destiny.
All right.
And I've been living here in New Orleans for about 20 years. So I do feel like I really pretty much from the time I arrived here, I felt like I was coming home. I'm very grateful for the place that I came from, though, Paducah, Kentucky. It's an idyllic little town on its own little river, and it was a very gentle type of a small town to grow up in. Of course, when I was in my teens, I was in a hurry to get out and explore the world.
Well, aren't we all?
I couldn't wait, which I did to some degree, but certainly now when I go back, I appreciate it for what it afforded me growing up. And one of the things that it afforded me growing up was growing up in a very sort of accepting community, even though it was a very small town in the South. It was, I've been struck over and over again by how tolerant it was and accepting.
I think that would surprise a lot of people when just the name Paducah sounds like, the Hicks.
Well, Paducah is actually named after an Indian chief, Chief Paducah. So that may have something to do with the tolerance there. Okay. I don't know. There's a statue of Chief Paducah in downtown Paducah, though.
Okay, so then you found your way to New Orleans. What have you done since you've been here?
Well, I went to school. After I left Paducah, I went to school up east, and I ended up eventually, after about 9 years living in New York City, I ended up sort of making a grand exodus to a place that I hoped would be a little bit better quality of life, a little bit more easygoing. And I had been to New Orleans once before and just been very, very struck by the beauty, one thing, of the architecture. I was here in October, so I was also, for the first time, so I was also struck by the beauty of the weather. I had not yet endured a summer in New Orleans. But when I was ready to leave New York, it was pretty much the first place that came to my mind. And I came down here and stayed with a friend for a while, not really expecting to stay here, but like so many people who come to New Orleans, not really expecting to stay. Again, here I am 20 years later. And I was already a freelance writer at the time, and as we talked about a little bit before, I was writing market research reports, and my day job is a market analyst, so I am a writer by trade, writing sort of book-length market research reports.
Was your training was in writing or in business, or What sort of educational background led you to where you are?
Well, I had a very, very practical educational background. I was a French major, so of course, if you're a French major, it automatically leads you to
literature.
Well, to
New Orleans.
To literature, and certainly that did play a great role in it. I did my junior year abroad in France, which was just a wonderful time, wonderful opportunity, and a lot of these experiences actually inform the novel that has come out of this, The Coffee Shop Chronicles of New Orleans. My narrator, B. Sammy Singleton, is a New York City expat who has landed in New Orleans. He was also a French major, but certainly the French influence of the city was also one of the great attractions that originally brought me here.
All right. Well, so through these years that you were here, and you were your occupation, and you made your living doing your business, your technical writing. Is that during that time? Were you also writing novels, even though this may be your first published ones? Do you have some unpublished novels?
I don't have any unpublished novels. I have quite a few unpublished short stories and poems, and I was just really never very inclined toward the marketing side, perhaps because that's what my day job entails, the whole marketing angle. It was more something that I've always done just to sort of satisfy a personal need. But I found that as I began getting older, and particularly reached the milestone of turning 40, I began to ask myself, well, what is it that I really want to do? And am I ever, I always kind of thought in the back of my mind that I would write a book, and particularly a novel. It was always just sort of, I wanted to write a novel, and then turning 40, I was kind of like, well, you know, when are you going to do this? And that's when I really started seriously working on my writing skills and beginning the process of this novel. The question of why I hadn't done anything up until that point also led me to a book called The Artist's Way. And The Artist's Way is a book that sort of encourages creativity and provides you with exercises toward sort of looking at yourself and looking at what it is you want to do creatively, and also why you're not doing it.
And that when you say artists, you're talking about artists in many fields, visual artists, musical artists, writers. You're just talking about art in general.
Just art in general.
And this book said, why aren't you doing it? Is that what this book said?
Well, it sort of guides you to look at reasons for, you know, I don't really like to use the word block, but that's probably the best descriptor of what prevents many people from pursuing their art, whether it's painting or writing or dance or music or whatever it might be. And I think many of those principles are the same. I think a lot of times they trace back to sort of messages that we receive in childhood that, oh, you can't make a living doing that, or it's not practical, or you need to pursue something that will actually, you know, provide for you and your family. I've certainly got those types of messages from a very early age. And The Artist's Way provides you with tools to sort of relearn more positive responses to your own desires to create. One of the tools that it provides you with is something that the book calls morning pages. And what
is that?
Morning pages are 3 pages of journaling every morning, no matter what. And I am particularly grateful to the morning pages because after about 2 years of doing that faithfully and really piling up a stack of pages, the first line, literally, of this book emerged as my journaling. And so this book takes a sort of pseudo-journaling format. The first part of the book does.
You were writing these journal pages every day for years.
For 2 years, yeah.
And what did they tell you to put into that journal?
Well, that's interesting. There are no rules. The only rule is you fill up 3 pages with words. So you can literally sit there and write, I don't have anything to say today, over and over again until you've filled up 3 pages. The point is showing up and being there and committing yourself to that little bit of time in the morning where you do that.
Well, when you're talking about 3 pages, I assume you're talking about handwritten pages, because these days everyone does it on a computer.
Absolutely. The handwriting is an important part of it, yes.
But 3 pages of a computer printout would be a lot longer than the 3 pages that you would do by hand.
Right.
Did you do your book on the computer?
I did. Well, like I said, it started in my journal, which was handwritten, but then once I sort of got into the third or fourth segment, if you will, which I suppose roughly paralleled what became chapters, I did start to, put it into the computer and to work that way, and that's the way that I'm used to working, most efficiently when I write.
Since you were attracted to New Orleans because of the culture and the artistic atmosphere, were you involved in any of the other arts of the city, whether it's theater or symphony or art galleries? Did you involve yourself in any of the other so-called cultural activities?
Sure, just in terms of attending the openings and going to the galleries and really tapping into the resources, the wealth of resources that the city offers. It's actually something it's almost ironic, because when I was in New York, I found myself so busy and just stressed that it was very, very difficult to find the time and the energy to be able to really tap into that. But once I got down to the Big Easy, I found that I had a lot more time and energy to become part of that. And it's also been very, very encouraging to feel that you're part of something that's growing. Because when I arrived here, the city, it was 1991. So I've witnessed, I feel like I've witnessed a rebirth of sorts of the city, and not just one, because of course we had the rebirth that was taking place prior to Katrina, and then we've had the amazing rebirth that's taken place since.
Exactly, and you live in a part of the city that really has had a renewal.
Absolutely, the Marigny, the Faubourg Marigny.
But renewal doesn't mean tearing down the old and building new. It means preserving the old.
Absolutely. In
New Orleans, and our Via Carré Commission, which controls what you can do in the Via Carré, is the second such district in the country, following Charleston, South Carolina. So this city has been concerned with preservation for a long time.
It has been. It's really wonderful. Even predating, the popular interest in preservation, even back in the '60s when there was talk of putting the highway through the French Quarter, and the preservationists really stood up and opposed that. That was a pretty major event at the time, and I think unusual. I think that's something about this city that is unusual. The residents, and particularly the natives, really do have a strong sense of understanding that the past really is important and worth preserving.
Well, and I don't know, we're going to talk about your book, and I don't know how much of that might involve the general atmosphere of New Orleans and the French Quarter. How long did you, from the day you decided to take your journals and make a book out of it, how long did it take you to complete your book?
Wow. I worked on the book for several years. It's really hard to pinpoint a date when it really became a book, or when I started thinking of it as a book, as opposed to sort of a string of anecdotal tales that I didn't really know what I was going to end up doing with. But I would say probably around 2005 was when I got really, really serious about it. Of course, one of the things that happened in the middle of it, actually it would have been a little before Katrina, probably the year before Katrina, because I was into it at that point, and I remember being evacuated, and I had actually gone home to Paducah, and I was staying in my mother's house, and it was a terrible time. No matter how you were affected personally in terms of whether your house was underwater or not, everyone who went here and evacuated went through that period of just not knowing, of really feeling like you may be just losing everything that you ever thought was important, your own material possessions, possibly your home, and possibly your city. So it was a very sort of difficult, traumatic time. And it was a time when I had sort of my own little existential crisis in terms of the book. Is this even something, should I even be worrying about something as incidental as a book when there's so many other terrible things going on? Might I be of better use out, in a boat rescuing people or something as opposed to working on my book? And so, like so many other works of art that were in progress during Katrina, my book did become, in a sense, my love song to New Orleans, my attempt to preserve the New Orleans that had given me so much and which I wanted to honor and also promote to a certain degree, because at that time, you probably recall the voices saying things like, well, should we rebuild New Orleans? And, look at all those poor people asking for handouts yet again. And it was very, very troubling. On top of the actual catastrophe that we had just been through, there was sort of this catastrophe of human consciousness that seemed so strange that it was directed at New Orleans when so many other cities have been through catastrophes and you don't hear that type of rhetoric directed at them. So.
All right. Now, the book we've been talking about is this one, The Coffee Shop Chronicles of New Orleans by David Loomis. Now, in preparing this, did you have an editor, or this is strictly the way it came out of your...
Oh no! I'm not that confident. I definitely had editors, but the book is. I would like to say that it's completely homegrown. It was written here. It was printed here. Both of my editors were either at Tulane or Tulane graduates. Susan Bergman was one of my editors. Another one was David Sprinkle, both of whom are good friends of mine. So it was sort of a process of working with friends. But these are also professional editors who really helped bring the book to fruition. But most important is my partner, Csaba Lukács, and I call him my publicist, my publisher, my promoter, and my partner, because he's the sort of force behind the book who said, this is a book. First of all, he read the journal, or I read it out loud, and he said, there's something going on here, and I think that you should continue this, and then physically made it possible in terms of sort of picking up the slack around the house and the other things that needed to be done and saying, go right. And also helping plotting and helping with character development. So it's very much been a collaborative project between him and me.
All right. Now let me tell our audience, because this is the Secular Humanist program, what it was that particularly attracted me to this book and to the author. This is a review from Amazon, which says, the agnostic, 10 years sober, son of a Baptist minister, B. Sammy Singleton, has an opinion about everything. He also has a guidebook on New Orleans coffee shops to write. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of that, but that line said to me, David Loomis has something to say that I'd like to hear. Now, how much of this is autobiographic?
That's an interesting question. It's so hard to say. A lot. But if I have to sort of do it mathematically, I would say 1/3 is really very closely autobiographical. 1/3 is based on a very close friend of mine who actually is the son of a Baptist minister, and another 1/3 of it is purely fictional. So anything that's scandalous that's the fiction part. That's not really about me.
All right. Any resemblance to people living
Absolutely.
or die is coincidental. Well, all right. Without giving away everything that's in the book, tell us where all of that leads us, this 10 years sober son of a Baptist minister. How does that fit into the Coffee Shop Chronicles?
Well, my narrator, B. Sammy Singleton, is as that little blurb said, he's the agnostic, 10-year sober son of a Baptist minister, and like myself, he finds himself living in New Orleans, and he's a freelance writer. So that part is obviously, semi-autobiographical. He has a freelance job to write a guidebook to New Orleans coffee shops. But what happens the day before the action is that his best friend Catfish Beaucoeur, who is heir to the Beaucoeur sugarcane fortune, is arrested on grave robbing charges. And Sammy has just picked him up from jail, and Catfish then goes missing rather mysteriously. So Sammy is thrust into this, he has trouble focusing anyway, so he's trying to write this guidebook, and he's going from coffee house to coffee house trying to do these little synopses of these places. But what he's realizing as he goes along is that, Catfish isn't showing up, and he becomes more and more concerned that this is unusual, to the point where he goes and physically starts searching for Catfish. And Catfish is a very, very moral person. He, as I said, he's the heir to the Beaucoeur sugarcane fortune, and all that brings with it, which is this terrible history of slaveholding that dates way, way back in his family. Catfish is very much a civil rights activist in the city of New Orleans, and Sammy is very aware of all of that. But he's also sort of almost taken a sort of a glib approach to dealing with that. He's never really taken it seriously. He's a little bit amused by it. He cares a great deal about Catfish. They're very close friends, but he's always sort of distanced himself from this very, very serious aspect of Catfish's own personal life and interest. But when Catfish goes missing, he finds that he can no longer do that. And so he gets drawn not just into the physical search for Catfish, but really into the psyche of Catfish and into some of these very, very complex moral issues surrounding the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in America, and what that really means for a white guy like Sammy, who has grown up really in a relatively privileged atmosphere, and he's been able to be pretty much shielded from some of these harsher truths. Of course, those types of questions also often lead into questions about one's own spirituality, if you will, one's own belief system. So Sammy suddenly finds himself also facing his own agnosticism. He's constantly doing this back and forth. I believe, maybe I don't believe, I believe, I don't believe, should I believe? And he's on a journey, and that journey really won't come to fruition until the third part of this book. It's a 3-part novel. This is part 1. Part 2 will be out later this year, and then part 3 next year. But it's a journey, and it is partly an autobiographical journey in which I am learning a lot more about myself and some of these historical themes than I ever really expected to.
And I was going to ask you the agnosticism of your character, meaning that he questions, is there or isn't there a supreme being? I presume that what he's going through is pretty much familiar to the people in our organization, many of whom went through that same agnostic period. Some of them are still in that period, but most of them came out of it by saying, I see no evidence of a supernatural. In your book, we will read more about the way this man suffered through trying to decide whether he believed or not. Am I correct?
Absolutely. That's there's sort of layers to this story, and I don't want to give too much away about the next 2 parts of it, but what I can tell you, because it's already sort of out there, is the timetable of the book. The first part is set across roughly a 2-week period leading up until August 25th, 2005. The second part takes place on Friday, August 26, 2005, all a single day. And then the third part the second part is also set in New Orleans or near New Orleans.
Okay.
But then the third part takes place during roughly a 2-month period post-Katrina, during which Sammy and his cohort have evacuated to Paducah, Kentucky.
Oh, okay.
And it's there that Sammy does his deepest reflection about his own spiritual quest.
All right, but I presume this book here is labeled Part 1.
Yes.
I presume it is complete in itself, but it must leave you with an appetite for part 2 and part 3.
It's a bit of a cliffhanger. It's a little bit of a non-traditional way of publishing.
All right.
Yes.
Now, what does this have to do with coffee shops?
Well, like I said, Sammy is a freelance writer, and what he's trying to do, the way this starts out for him as well, is that he's trying to write this guide to coffee shops. But what he's doing really is he's journaling. So he's sitting there sort of doodling and journaling and saying, I'm sitting here trying to write this, write about CC's Coffee House or PJ's Coffee House or Rosnico Coffee House, Café du Monde, depending on where he is. So these become sort of the locale for his narration. And it's his musings as he's sitting there supposedly writing this guide. It's sort of like the negative space becomes the story. And so Sammy ends up going off onto these digressions about, for example, how he ended up in New Orleans, how he ended up meeting catfish, how his first family trip to New Orleans for a Baptist convention when he was 14 years old. Okay. So there's a lot of sort of a historical, personal reminiscences
now,
there.
I assume this book is now available for purchase. Is it in the bookstores? Or
Yes.
It's in the bookstores and can probably be bought from Amazon or other sources.
Sure.
All right. Well, I'm looking at this review that came from Amazon. I'm just looking at the last line, and it says, Loomis's Chronicles is a love song to New Orleans, alternately funny, painful, entertaining, and always unflinchingly honest. The Coffee Shop Chronicles of New Orleans is a must-read. Now, I'm looking at it says it's alternately funny, painful, and entertaining. Is this a humorous book?
That's another very good question. It starts out, from what I understand, it is quite funny for most of the book. Sammy is very, he's sarcastic at times, he's glib at times, but as with his whole personal journey, as he proceeds, the themes become less and less humorous and more serious and close to home for him.
And so when they say it's also alternately painful, we're going to run into some pain in this book.
That's right.
Is it going to be painful to the reader?
I hope so. It should be. Some of the things that are presented in the book are very, very serious topics that I feel are things that anyone who wants to call themselves an American should be aware of in terms of our country's past.
All right. Well, David, we've got about a minute or so left, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to say whatever you would like to about yourself, about your book, or about New Orleans, whatever you would like the audience to hear from you. Well,
just that living in New Orleans in post-Katrina it's a whole new day. I think that one of the things I love about being in New Orleans today is that the people who are here are people who choose to be here, who understand that we are working to rebuild something still. We're here because we want to be here. We're here because we choose to be here. We're taping this show today in the middle of a tropical storm, which is only a week away from the anniversary of Katrina. We understand that we're living below sea level, and we love it. And we're here for a reason. So I just feel very honored to be part of the New Orleans community. And one of the things that my narrator says in the book, what Sammy says, is he arrived in New Orleans and New Orleans took him in, no questions asked. And I certainly feel that way about the city myself, that when I arrived here I was coming home and I can't imagine living anywhere else.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you here. I'm looking forward to reading your book, and we'll have to talk to you when we get part 2 and part 3. David, thank you very much for being here, and thank you folks for watching our show. Come back and see us again next week.